if you want to know who
Oh.
she is, which one she is. Uh, so we're going to be talking about that subject. And just before we get into it, I want to encourage you to be thinking of questions, because that's really it's not really about just the questions that I have. We'll just get started with those, but what are the questions you have as you're exposed to this idea and we raise it to let's say top of mind, well, that you're currently thinking. So Melanie, welcome. It's
Uh,
very wonderful to have you be able to exchange some ideas with you. I think, to get started so that people have an orientation, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you born, brothers and sisters, education? Just kind of give us the 50,000-foot Melanie story.
the really boring Melanie story. Well, my name's Melanie Benjamin, and I an author. I write historical fiction, and The Children's Blizzard is the book that has been chosen. I'm so grateful and proud and pleased by South Dakota Humanities for One Book, One South Dakota. So that's why I'm here today, and I'm very excited. I was born in the Midwest, actually, in Indianapolis, Indiana. And this book is important to me because it is kind of it is the first book I've ever written that has got some echoes in my own family history. My mother's family were German, who came over at roughly the same time period as the Children's Blizzard, like in the 1880s, although they settled in Illinois, not the Dakota Territory. But still, these immigrant farmers are in my DNA. So that's why this is a very special book for me. I was born in Indianapolis, and I always wanted to be an actress when I grew up, which surprises people because I guess authors are supposed to have been born knowing that they wanted to write, and that wasn't my case. But I was always a huge reader. My imagination was always out of control and got me in a lot of trouble. And I think I was always a storyteller at heart. And I got married. I had two children. We lived in Chicago for about 25 years, and recently, very, very recently, moved to Williamsburg, Virginia. I have written 7 historical novels, as The Children's Blizzard is my 7th one. My other novels were based on real people, real stories of real people who have lived, who mainly women whose stories I felt had not really been fully explored in history or told. The Children's Blizzard is my first historical novel. It is based around a real event, the 1888 blizzard known as the Children's Blizzard that hit the Great Plains on January 12th. And I invented the characters in this novel based on some of the oral histories that I read of survivors and those who witnessed the storm. And so that's a little bit about me.
Well, in that introduction, and thank you for that, it suggests that geography and climate has directly impacted you too. And I'm wondering, how conscious of that are you? And if you are, can you give us some examples of how climate and weather and geography has created Melanie?
Well, I think as a child of the Midwest, right? I grew up knowing what a tornado watch was versus a tornado warning. We had our basement that we would go to sometimes in the middle of the night. We had a little transistor radio tuned in, to tell us if there was a tornado approaching. And Midwestern weather, to me, that's what it is, right? Tornadoes in the spring, summer, and early fall. That certainly colored my childhood. And then as my husband and I we've moved quite a lot, sometimes for his work, for his work early on, and then by choice. It's always been interesting to discover the different weather patterns of the places that we've moved to, and what are the major concerns and issues there. And if we lived quite a lot, raised our children, lived quite a long time in Chicago, and of course that's a different weather pattern. There really aren't tornadoes. There's something about the lake and that kind of breaks up approaching, weather patterns. But certainly we had cold and we had, the winds, and we had the lake effect snow. And the last 5 years that we lived in Chicago, we moved right near the lake. We were out in the suburbs, but we moved within half a mile of the lake. And I was really stunned to see how much the lake affected our weather. That it would be cloudy and a good 10 to 15 degrees chillier where we were versus out in the suburbs. The sun would shine and it would be that much warmer because of the lake. And we would get these funny little mists that would just kind of come in, and it wouldn't be exactly raining, but it would be like a heavy, heavy fog with dew in it. And that was just, again, that was all coming in from the lake. So that was really interesting to me. And certainly we've witnessed in the years that we lived there, the erosion of the lakefront. And it is a big issue in Chicago right now, how they're going to deal with that, because the levels in Lake Michigan have risen quite a lot in the last few years. And it truly has eroded many of the beaches to the point where Lakeshore Drive might actually be in peril at some point. So, certainly we experienced that. And then we recently moved in September, wanting to kind of get a little warmer climate, a little less expensive climate or place to live. And as we were researching the places we wanted to move to, the effects of climate change were right up there on the top of our concerns and questions. And some of the areas that we really thought we were going to possibly, move to, which would be mainly the Southwest or California, when we did our research, because that's what I do, I'm a researcher, we had to rule that out because the impact of climate change is accelerating so rapidly in those areas. So that became a top criteria. Where could we move that satisfied some of our other criteria, but yet did not put us in a danger zone for climate change that is just too rapid at this point? There's no place that's immune. Everywhere we go is affected by it. But we were certainly looking for a place where the rate of acceleration was a little bit slower. And that is what led us to the Williamsburg area in part, because it's an hour away from the ocean. We're not on a floodplain. Certainly it's getting warmer like the rest of the planet, but it's just not as extreme as it is in other areas in the country. So yeah, it was a big part of our criteria.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you're talking about that, one of the things that come to mind is this rather obscure idea that most people don't think about, but marketers certainly do, and that's called psychographics. And that is the idea that people who will buy certain products have other certain similarity in terms of preferences and lifestyles. And for example, if you want to advertise razor blades, there are certain programs that people who buy a lot of razor blades, they have in common that they watch. So right. I'm wondering, I bring that up because I'm wondering if weather doesn't create culture kind of in that same way, like people who like certain kind of weather, like some people, they can't handle cold, cold. Give me cold and, give me death, it's like, and then there are other people who they can't stand heat, their idea is like, look, if it's cold, I can put on more clothes and stay indoors. But if it's hot, it's just hot, different people have different things. And I'm wondering if those things don't play into drawing those kind of people together, and then their sharing of similar ideas and preferences ends up making a local culture. In your research, have you seen the potential for such kind of phenomena?
Well, I think certainly when we think about the Midwest, when we think about homesteaders, again, so many of whom were immigrants to the country, you get an idea in your mind, right, of a true character, right, a stolid character, someone not inclined to complain and not inclined to discuss their emotions, and people who work hard and perhaps don't indulge themselves very frequently and are stoic and courageous, and because they've had to live with, I think, the elements in a way. particularly when you're talking about the Great Plains, and particularly during the time period of this book, when you had, it was the tail end of the Little Ice Age, so that the winters were extremely punishing. But then you also had, grasshoppers falling from the sky and eating the crops, and prairie fires and floods and tornadoes that we talked about. I think the element, there's no place, I don't think, in this country that has more weather and more different kinds of weather and harsher elements than the Great Plains. It's just the way the geography of this area is. And I do think that has kind of carved out a character and a people and a community, I suppose you could say, or a demographic that, I think, yes, that certainly we depict anyway, or we feel like, or just a different kind of people than those who live in New York or those who live in New Orleans, right? I absolutely think climate has had a huge part in shaping that Midwestern character. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that like people who like live in mountainous areas, they seem to have like a certain point of view of like how they look at things. People who live near the sea and actually visit the sea, there's something different about their minds. And not to mention that if you're on an ocean front, you come in contact with more people and more things at the interface of land and sea, so that's a lot in terms of like how we think about the world.
Well, think about Ralph Lauren, who made a fortune, right? Designing preppy clothes that are based on a kind of New England Cape Cod yachting lifestyle, right? So that was shaped by that kind of image of the preppy person who lives on Cape Cod, who has a summer home on Cape Cod, and spends a lot of time on the water, right? Sailing, boating. That became an entire fashion trend that persists to this day, and it's based on a geography of people who live in a certain, who live on the ocean. And we think about Colorado. I mean, my son lived in Colorado several years, and it truly is kind of I don't want to say, well, there's a reason why Colorado legalized marijuana before anyone else did in this country. I think there is
and why they were using it before they legalized it.
Yeah, exactly. There's absolutely a reason about that. And he talked about that. My son is 30 now. He lived there for a few years, and he's very much into fitness. And that was kind of one reason why he moved from Chicago to Colorado, because he thought there'd be more opportunities for outdoor fitness. But he soon found out that his idea of fitness is running in races and going to a gym. But in Colorado, everyone's climbing mountains, right? And going out and skiing all the time. And he didn't really like skiing. And that kind of frenzied outdoor adventure kind of spirit is a real thing. I mean, he truly encountered it. And it's one reason why he just decided maybe Colorado wasn't for him. Yeah.
Yes, there are so many examples like that. In your book, can you give us an example from your book of how the weather influenced an action or an attitude in one or more of your characters?
Well, I think in the book, the main protagonists are children of immigrants. Maybe they were born in the old country, but they came over here very, very young. So they grew up with this weather in a way that perhaps their parents certainly didn't. And there is a character in the novel, a man named Gavin, who is based is a newspaper man, a failed, jaded newspaper man who is responsible for writing what was truly propaganda and disinformation campaigns, luring immigrants to this land, selling them a false promise, saying that the climate was much, much milder and forgiving than it turned out to be. So we see him in the storm and him going out in the aftermath of the storm, and he's from New York and he's not used to this weather, and he struggles, right? He doesn't, he doesn't understand why people would live there, and then he realizes he's a reason why, because he told them it wasn't this bad. And so his experience out of the plains in the aftermath of the storm, when he's heading out to find stories of the storm, is very, very different than the experiences of those children of immigrants who were caught out in it. Even though many of them perished, and even though it did catch even them by surprise, at least they certainly understood, they understood what they were facing. They were brought up in this climate. They knew that in a storm, generally speaking, you shelter in place. This storm hit at a particularly perilous time of the day and caught them unawares because it had been a warmer morning. So yes, they perished, but still, these are children of the soil. These are children of the land who absolutely understood the land in a way this newspaper man from the East absolutely did not understand this land. And so yes, definitely in those two cases. Yeah.
Great. Well, we're going to, in short order here, open up our conversation to the rest of our participants, since we want to give everybody who wants to have a chance to have a conversation with Melanie. So anybody want to get started? I have lots more questions, but I think there's enough of you that you should have some questions too. So just kind of give a hands up, because we have quite a few people. So try to keep this in order. Anybody who has a question?
I have my chat window up, so if you type in the chat, I could also see it that way if you didn't want to speak.
Okay, yeah, that's reasonable.
I did kind of want to talk about the way weather impacts people of different demographics unfairly. We could talk about that even for certainly today. People who live in poverty are way more impacted by climate change or extremes in weather than those who have the means to shelter in place and shelter in a sturdy structure and get text alerts on their phones. And in the novel, and this was true at the time, weather predicting was in its infancy. So it wasn't like people had a lot of warning, yet still those who lived in towns, those who lived nearer railroad stations, at least had the warning flags or the indications in the newspaper that they could read for the next day. Now, they weren't very accurate. They often came too late, but still it was something, versus the homesteaders who were out there on their 120 acres out in the middle of the prairie, far from each other, who didn't have any indication. And again, these were people in large part unfamiliar to this land. It was just still so new. So unlike the Native Americans, whose land it had been, they weren't used to studying the land, studying the weather to try to kind of predict it. It was something they had to learn over generations. And so the impact on the weather certainly fell a lot more squarely on their shoulders than it did those in towns. So
yeah, I think it's worthwhile pointing out too, especially in the case of Native Americans, that they were pushed from places where they did understand the weather into places they didn't, and there was nobody I could find that knew how to do that at that time, And I think that you have a follow-up or a similar situation where if you have a neighborhood that was, let's say, of people with, let's say, fewer means, that crops up in a place that actually is nice in many different regards, they're often gentrified out of that neighborhood, or they run a freeway or something like that through it, so that people who have the means can then occupy that, and what's left is the places that don't work.
Well, that's, when you think about the forced relocation, the genocide with Andrew Jackson when he was president, with the Trail of Tears that took all the southeastern Native Americans and forced them to march to the Great Plains. Again, a climate they weren't used to, a climate they had to get used to over generations. I mean, that was a perfect example of that. And then once they were on the Great Plains, as the nations further took territories and expanded west, in great part because of the Homestead Act, again, they're taken from in some cases like mountain Indians, and forced to go into, the Great Sioux Reservation in Eastern Dakota territory at that time. Completely different climate, completely different land. And it forced to, right? Like your point, gentrification in a way. Yeah.
Mm.
We do have
We
a
have
question over there.
yeah,
Okay.
there's a question of were there any instances of writing the novel where you had to break with the factual details of history in order to strengthen the fictional aspect of the story?
Well, there's always is when you're writing a novel. You can't include every fact because then it's not a novel. You have to concentrate on the story you're telling. In my experience writing historical novels, it more often means I leave things out rather than changing any facts or knowingly rearranging facts, actual things that we know happen. It's more that I leave some of them out in order to concentrate on just a few elements that will make a really tightly constructed novel. In the case of the Children's Blizzard, I don't think, though, that I did really, because I'm concentrating in such a short period of time. The bulk of the book takes place within, just a couple of weeks' time. I didn't really have to leave anything out in that case. And I'm trying to think of anything I changed drastically for the novel's construction, and I really can't think of anything. Now, certainly the characters are fictional, their experiences are fictional. But as far as the facts, the timeline of the blizzard, the aftermath of it, including the heroines fund that I write about, the newspaper, the way they treated the aftermath of the storm, that is all very factual in this case. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that becomes more apparent, at least to me, as far as fiction writing, is that as we get better as researchers, we find that often fact is stranger than fiction and more entertaining if we could just tell that story. And sometimes we have to put context to it, but often there's people have some incredible
Well,
stories.
that's true. But as a novel, a novelist, I'm really concentrating on the emotions, right? I'm concentrating on, yes, we know these people did these things, or these people survived the storm, or they didn't survive the storm, but what were they thinking?
Yes.
What were the reasons behind the choices they made? That's emotion, that's fictional. That's what a novelist is really concentrating on. There's a question here about Minna and Ingrid. I took the fate of many of the children in the novel that I wrote about is somewhat based on, in cases were based on actual fates of the real children who survived or did not during the storm. And this is what I mean, where I read the oral histories, and there is a collection of the oral histories of this storm called In All Its Fury. And it's about the Great Blizzard of 1888. So some of the fates of the children that have been passed down, through generations, I really did use for some of the fates of the children in this novel. So yes.
Well, that brings up a very interesting observation that someone pointed out to me, who is his job is a graveyard keeper. And so as a result, he's become more than just a person that digs the holes. He's very interested in the culture of graves. And he pointed out to me that there are certain histories that you can find in graves just by the number of, let's say, children who died at a certain period of time, or numbers of people who have like the same death date, or something like
So
that.
there was a tragedy of some kind in the area. Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
And I was going to say, and then when you go and look at those people's death records, then the story kind of starts to unveil itself. And you see that there was then you can look at the newspaper articles, but there's a certain etching of history in those graves and their proximity and the ages of the people when they died, and whether the husband died or the wife died or both died. All of those things are engravings, historical engravings that if you know the code, you can read interesting things into.
That's so true. And if you've ever visited older graves, older cemeteries, certainly there are a lot more children who died in those years in the 1800s, early 1900s than there are today. And I remember this just reminded me of a story when my children were small. We went to our little town that we lived in outside of Chicago was a village that was built in like the 1850s. And so there were some historic sites and a historic grave site. And there were a lot of children's graves. And I remember our children, they were like fourth graders, getting so upset seeing these children's graves, even though they were like in the 1880s. Some of them burst into tears crying over that fact that there were so many dead children in this cemetery. And it was just, I don't know, that touched me in a way. I just thought, oh, well, that really makes history personal, right? Even to fourth graders, right?
Yeah. Who can be a very snidey bunch.
Yeah. Now, here's a question. Is there an accurate death toll? And there really isn't. And what I can't remember. I have it in my book. I'm trying to look it up. There is a death count that I have in my book, and it was, golly, I can't find it. 235 was the official death count, but certainly it was much greater than that. There were difficulties, obviously, in those days with record keeping. Many people died of their injuries months later and so weren't counted. Some bodies weren't found until the spring thaw, so they weren't counted. And nowhere could I find any accounting of a death toll on the Great Sioux Reservation. And I just assumed then that nobody cared to go check and see if any of the Native Americans on the reservation, how many survived and how many didn't. So it's certainly an undercounting of what is the official death count. Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to point out, time period really made a difference. My grandfather had immigrated in the 1880s. And so he used to tell me when I was about 5 or 6 years old about that. But there was the way of finding the weather was to read the clouds.
Right.
So you couldn't prepare for it in advance. I've got somebody at my door, but I'll listen to your reply. Thank you.
That is absolutely true. And one of the great things when you write a novel is when you hear from people who it touches. And I have heard from quite a few people who shared with me the stories about their great uncle, perished in the storm, or they remember their great grandmother talking about it. It had such an impact still today to those who live in this area. But certainly, yeah, as we said, there was no real National Weather Service in that time period. The Army Signal Corps was in charge of indicating the weather. And the way they had to gather the data was laborious. Stations usually at Army forts across the country would telegraph in wind readings, temperature readings, and from that they would try to gather all the information in and put some kind of indication together, and then they had to telegraph it back out. And that by that time, usually the weather had passed through. And often there was a lot of corruption also. And so a lot of the readings were not accurate that had been telegraphed in. Sometimes, and this is true, those in charge of telegraphing in and taking all the weather data in would pay somebody to do it for them while they went off on a hunting trip or something. So, and so once it was gathered and sent back out to the various forts and telegraph stations and train stations, the only way that people could read about it was in the newspaper, if they happened to take one of the newspapers, like the Omaha Daily Bee, or they would raise flags on the train stations and the Army forts. There were certain flags to indicate certain types of weather that came through. But again, you would have to be able to live within sight of those. Certainly no one on the prairie was getting a daily newspaper. That just didn't happen.
If they were, the weather had passed by the time they got it.
Exactly. And also, we forget so many of them couldn't even read English.
Exactly.
That was not their native language. So yes, they had to learn to read it in the sky. And again, we're talking about, in large part, people coming to a land who were not born on this land, either coming from overseas or from the east, somewhere else where the weather was completely different. So it took generations, right? It took a while for them to learn to read the land and to learn to read the weather, which is why weather had such a bigger, one of the reasons why weather had a greater impact on people's lives back then.
Right.
I mean, there are other reasons, certainly, about the state of the homes they lived in, what the structures that they lived in, the clothing that they wore, relying on livestock for transportation, not being able to get into a town to get supplies, living on a prairie where there's very little, at that point, very few trees. You couldn't just really often go out and chop down a tree for fuel. You had to, rely on other means. So yeah, there are a lot of reasons why weather had a greater impact in the 1880s than it does today.
Right. I mean, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that weather prediction is really new.
So new.
It's really new, and it's still evolving. It's still like lots of holes in the weather models, and people are working on that, and like up until like 2 or 3 days, that's a lot better than 2 or 3 hours. But there's a lot of big question marks and holes in even the present day models, and they're being revised, but
all the time.
Worthwhile. Yeah, it's worthwhile, even the timing and also the access to it. Whereas before, you might have an almanac, which is like more or less almost like a horoscope, compared to what we have now.
Yeah.
Then, and then now we actually can get it on the internet. We can go right to NOAA and see exactly what NOAA is saying, and almost everybody else is getting their information and tweaking their models based on NOAA. So
and we get text alerts, right? I mean, who hasn't been awakened in the middle of the night by that blaring saying that there's dangerous weather on the way or around? That's incredible to me that we get that.
Exactly. And how much different those people's lives would have been.
Oh, yeah. But I also think this is one thing we've noticed moving from Chicago to where we live in Williamsburg, Virginia. Chicago weather was still very hard to predict. If it said it was going to rain, 50-50 chance whether the rain would actually get there. And I do think in large part it's because the lake just had such an unpredictable effect on incoming weather fronts. But down here, we've noticed if it says it's going to rain, it's going to rain. That the weather is much easier to predict, seems to us anyway. This is just our unscientific observation. It seems that it's more accurate to predict where we live right now. And there must be something about the topography, the geography of where we live, that they're just more predictable weather patterns. And I assume in the Dakotas, it's also kind of iffy if you get
Well, I would say that we have one reliable weather prediction here, and that is it's going to change.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, I bet.
Any more questions from our esteemed guest?
I see people raising their hands.
Yes, go ahead, Charles.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Some years ago, I edited several county histories, South Dakota counties. And of course, there were blizzard of 88 stories in those histories. Horrific, most of them. And I wonder if you've been learned much about generational trauma in the course of writing your book. I remember one story, for instance, someone remembered from her childhood that the dead bodies were brought into the shack and stacked behind the wood stove to thaw them out, as opposed to move them out of their grotesque death, frozen death circumstance. So how would one ever really fully recover from that? And what were the consequences of that generationally? And I think about that not just in regard to the blizzard of 88, but other historical traumas.
Right. No, I think, go ahead.
That's it. That's my question.
Well, I think, yes, absolutely, generational trauma. I mean, the people who have spoken with today who are still handing down those stories, right? Who's, my great grandmother told my grandmother, who told my mother. I mean, that is absolutely handed down. I do think it kind of goes into that whole mythology of the homestead or the stoicness, because these most likely weren't the first losses they had since coming to the prairie. And in fact, in my book, I have a character observe kind of that fact, how the prairie has chewed people up and spit them out, not always whole again. And I think for sure that goes into that American mythology of the prairie, the pioneer, right? Because of the loss shapes you, and the loss sometimes, I don't want to say deadens you inside, but it lends itself to that suppression of emotion, right? That kind of character trait of being able to withstand everything because you've lost so much prior to this. I think it all goes into that generational, what you're talking about, generational trauma. I was also really fascinated to realize, and I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me before, but the children who survived the children's blizzard were the grandparents who had to survive the Dust Bowl. I mean, this part of the world, the climate that these people had to endure from one generation to the next, pretty much, is traumatic. It's just completely traumatic. We all know stories of the Dust Bowl days, right? These are the people who were alive during the children's blizzard too. So think of all the loss of those generations of people in the Great Plains. Your grandparents, right? My grandparents. It's hard to sometimes fathom how much happened in such a short amount of time. Yeah.
And I think that really does shape us, not only consciously in terms of the stories, as you were mentioning, but it sets up certain patterns of like how we deal with the times when there are no traumas, where there are,
Yeah.
everything is
You're
going.
always kind of expecting something though, right?
Yeah,
I mean, isn't that part of the character, of the people we know? I mean, and my family too, you're just waiting for that other shoe to drop almost all the time.
Exactly. And there's that whole thing now that we discovered about how when one generation experiences a trauma, the results of it happens in not the next generation, but the generation afterwards. Like if people went through a starvation period, their parents don't demonstrate it as much as the grandchildren tend to overeat.
Huh.
I've
not heard that. Wow.
But yes, that's it's an observation that has been quite interesting to see, and that was just one example. But they're saying that like something happens, that the reaction, whether it's DNA or whatever, there's a reaction.
Delayed.
Yes, it delayed, and it doesn't really happen with the next one, or even like in child abuse and things like that. Where you would expect like it's a child that experiences that, and not that that doesn't happen, but oddly, it's the generation after that something happens that you start to see some kind of effect. So that's an interesting observation too, as in terms of weather affecting people.
There are a couple other questions that popped up in chat. Someone's asking how long I spent researching the novel before writing it, and did I have to continue doing research as I was constructing the story? Yeah, there wasn't this one didn't take a lot of research. I tend to write about things I already know kind of a lot about. So I certainly have a lot of books on my bookshelves about the Great Plains, about the homesteading years. Biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder that came out a couple of years ago was very helpful. Always read Willa Cather, and she and the land is an area I know. So it wasn't new to me. So it was more just really about learning about the weather, indicating at that time period, which was something I didn't know. And I did think that David Laskin's historical book, not a novel, but a nonfiction book about the children's blizzard, he goes into a lot more detail about the weather indicating process and the infighting and the politics than I do in my book, but that was really helpful. So that I had to learn. And yes, always there is a time period when you're writing along and you think you've got all the history, the research you need up there or written down, and then you get to a place and you're like, oh, well, I need to know. And this happened to me with the train lines, that Gavin, when he goes out from Omaha, and they tell him, because he's such a city slicker and a tenderfoot, they say just keep to the train lines. That way you won't go off and get lost in the middle of the prairie. And so I kind of had to stop and go look up a map of the various train lines at that time that left from Omaha, and which directions they went, and to which towns they would go. And of course, most of them are no longer around today. So yeah, so that was a point where I just had to stop writing, and I had to go off and spend a day or so Googling that and finding a map. Fortunately, Google is my friend. It is so helpful for historical novelists these days. I don't know that I would write historical fiction if I didn't have access to it, because it's been very, very helpful to me. So yeah, certainly there are times you have to stop writing and go research something that you hadn't planned on.
Do you do much, in this case, probably more likely impossible, but like a first person research? In other words, even if it's not like the person who reasonably should be dead, but somebody that
No.
knew somebody that knew someone.
No, I don't. I've never interviewed anyone for any of my novels, even the ones based on real people, because that would stifle my creativity as a novelist. I have to be able to treat these characters, real or imagined, fully. The only way I can do it anyway is just, they're mine. It's my head, my perspective. It's my imagination is my biggest tool. And I think my biggest strength as a novelist, my ability to imagine myself in these people's shoes. So no, I'm not going to go talk to them, because I feel that would stifle my imagination.
Yeah,
So,
you would be trying to be true to what they told
it would make me way too conscious of trying to be true to the facts, which is not generally good for a novel. I hate to say that. Even a novel based on fact, at some point you can't let the truth get in the way of a story. You can't. That's why it's a novel.
You should know some of the people I know. they defy description, though. Anyone else?
Somebody mentioned Isaac Storm by Eric Larson, which is it's a great book. I've read it, about the Galveston hurricane and the history of meteorology at that point as well, which has happened a little bit later. Maybe it was like maybe 20 years later than the children's blizzard. So things had actually changed a bit. But yeah, that's a good book. Yeah.
But, the interesting thing is how recently, modern meteorology has come into its being. A lot having to do with the reporting mechanisms.
The satellite imagery, right? That is a huge part of it now, which didn't exist how many years ago? 70 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. Yeah.
Right. And now what we know from the satellite images that we can corroborate on the ground with lots of different data points being gathered all the time.
Oh yeah.
And so
you get those spaghetti models like of hurricanes, right? Where they're telling you it could go here, it could go there, it could go there, it could go there. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you get into the computation of going from this is what's going to happen to dealing in proper science as in probability. And anyway, it's a fascinating study.
And ever changing. Yeah.
Ever changing, right? Like as I mentioned, there's some big holes in the models that people are very well aware of and are working on ways to fill in those holes. So we go from being able to tell what the weather is going to be like in the next hour to 3 days, and then at this point, apparently, after 3 days is real iffy, and a week is just sort of like anybody's coin toss.
Right. I mean, how many times have I looked at the 10-day forecast, right? And I know that, anything after day 5 it could change again the next time I look at it. Yes. But yet I find myself constantly, sometimes, like if I'm going on vacation and I want to know if it's going to rain when I'm going on vacation, I'm constantly looking at that 10-day forecast, even though I know it's not that accurate yet.
That's right.
But we're dependent, I think, on the technology. Obviously, our generation, people alive today, we're dependent on our phones. We're dependent on all the technology, and that makes me sometimes just really talk about putting myself in someone else's shoes of the people that I've written about in this novel. How how dependent they could only be on themselves and their past experience. right? That was it. That's all they had.
Maybe that's all any of us have. Lee, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think some people get what weather and climate, they are not the same.
Exactly.
Weather is part of climate, but I took a class, I think, at the university in the last couple of years, and it was basically how the climate has changed and how it affects the plains. And I noticed that when I came back to South Dakota, that they grew corn in West River. And of course, it's corn, how they changed production so they could, fit the climate. But it's like about 200 to 300 miles difference, the latitude of climate. So we have near like what Wichita in the central, somewhere in there, that climate is now moving up toward these plains like South Dakota. And that's one of the reasons. So even though, they say it's warming and they have a this is not warming up. Well, that isn't a true connection.
Sure, it's changing all the time, and we
Right.
we look at animals and insects and birds and their migration patterns and their nesting patterns and their breeding patterns have changed geographically because of the changes in the climate. I mean, there's certainly the data is there, but your point is a good one, that weather is not the same as climate, but climate affects the weather and weather affects the climate.
Well, another angle to how weather affects culture, in the book Guns, Germs, and Steels, the author points out that a lot of the advancement in certain civilizations has to do with people going from east to west, migrations east to west as opposed to north to south. And he points out that if you're going from east to west, if for whatever reason the shape of your landmass, which you're not really aware of, but at the time when more people were migrating in that way, you have less adjustments to make for growing crops than if you're going from north to south, because going from north to south, the weather patterns change a lot more than if you go from east to west in more or less a straight line. So that comes back to the idea that the stability of weather and the geography is certainly majorly responsible for the creation of the weather as well as the climate, is really dependent. It really impacts how cultures evolve. Whether or not you have to spend all your time looking for food, or whether or not you find it more difficult to continue moving, or, hey, this is a nice place, and by the time we finish eating food over here, there's some more over here. Let's just stay here, So all of those kind of things are to me are examples of how geography and climate and weather affects our culture.
And absolutely think about what the culture of the Great Plains will be when the time comes that it is no longer feasible to be, it will no longer be the nation's breadbasket. When over farming and the lack of, aquifers drying up, climate, changing, when that's no longer an agricultural, geographical center of our country, what will it do to the culture of that area? What is it doing now in the Inland Empire of California, right? The places that have grown, traditionally, it's too hot now sometimes, it's too dry now sometimes to grow, say, almonds, to have almond groves and things like that, because it takes too much water. What is that going to do when that goes away? Yeah, I mean, it's not outside the imagination that this will happen at some point, maybe in our lifetime.
My junior high school history teacher, and I always remember this because it was stunning to me. He said, there are a lot of things that people attribute to this leap in knowledge and that we're experiencing in your lifetime. He said, but really, it's about the fact that for the last 50 years, we've had some of the most stable weather patterns in human history.
Hmm.
And as a result, even though we're still looking for food and trying to grow food, he said, a lot more people have to spend a lot less time worrying about how they're going to eat. And historically, if your wealth is determined by discretionary income and leisure time, most of that time is devoted to trying to find food. And so
Mhm.
the people who get the food thing figured out, they will have more time just to think. It's not that they're smarter, it's just that they have more time uh, to think, to experiment, and they
To
have more
write, to
latitude
paint, to
to make
compose music. Yes.
right
Yeah.
art, that they can make more, they can
Yeah.
afford to make more mistakes. And it's from the
Right.
mistakes that we learn stuff.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
so here's another example, I think, of how weather creates culture.
Yeah, no, exactly. Another example I thought of, and this is where I guess kind of, it's not weather, but it's still climate. I was thinking about how in the early days of the colonies on the East Coast, because, we live here now in colonial Williamsburg, which is, it was the planter society where they planted primarily tobacco
Mm.
that did require slave labor, but that tires out the soil so fast, and they didn't quite understand that. So when the soil got too tired to continue growing tobacco, that's when cotton took over, and that requires so much more labor.
Mhm.
And that is what drove the antebellum South.
Mm.
And then ultimately led to the Civil War and everything we still experience today. But that's an example of the geography anyway,
Mhm.
changing a culture completely.
That's
Yeah.
right. And of course, all of these crops, they change the weather pattern too. Not only do
Yeah.
they, because they chop down trees to plant things, other things, but
Mhm.
also
Mhm.
when you plant a different kind of crop, it's the old butterfly effect, where lots of
Right.
things keep changing just because you change the vegetation, and then that changes the kind of insects, and that changes the kind of birds that are that come around for the insects,
Mhm.
and those birds eating seeds and pooping in other places
Mhm.
plant different kinds. So everything starts to change.
Everything's connected on the planet. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Including our culture to the
Yes.
weather.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Other comments or questions that people have. It's a golden opportunity.
They've been really good questions so far. It's been great.
Mhm. Anybody else? Okay, so if you think of something, just give us some kind of high sign, since a lot of people have their cameras off. We can't see if you're raising your hand if you're doing that. Also, we do have the chat. So if you have a something that you maybe you're too shy to show your beautiful face, you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's always helpful.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so what kinds of things are you going to continue on this kind of path
Of which kind of path?
of looking at the connection between climate, weather, geography, etc.,
Actually, my
and
next
or how
novel.
cultures are come together?
Yeah, actually, and I didn't really see the connection between this novel and the one I think I'm going to be writing next, which I can't yet share. It's
Come
taking me a
on.
while to find a new topic and a new. There've been a lot of business things going on behind the scenes that's give so. But I do think what I'm going to write next, yes, is very much about a culture affected by the geographical location and the climate so that it takes place in. And that's all I can tell you. It's not a tragedy the way that this novel was, and it's not based on one particular meteorological event. It's not quite like that, and it's in a different time period.
Mm.
But very much the geographical location completely informs the culture. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's all I can say. Sorry.
Okay, good. Well, I think there's so many examples of this that it just kind of gushes out once you pull the plug out.
Mhm.
Everything from what kind of locomotion or transportation you use. For example, if you lived in Venice, boats are a lot more important,
Mhm. Mhm.
or if you live on an island,
Mhm.
where, yeah, you could walk to the other side of the island, but since that's a mountain, it's much easier to just take your canoe and just go around. It takes you like half a day rather than 3 days to a week,
Mhm.
or things like uh, mountains versus plains, like
Mhm.
what kind of muscles are developed in people who are walking up and down mountains, what kind of animals, like if you live in mountains, unless you got those special cows with, shorter legs on one side than the other side, you probably want to have a different kind of animal husbandry. What kind, like in Japan, they grow a lot of rice because they terrace. Uh, that
Right.
so and you have to flood and then drain the floods and stuff. That's a lot harder to do on the plains, you know.
Mhm.
So
You know,
all of those things like impact what you grow, what your time, what's your rhythm like every day,
sure.
uh, how much time, like if you're in a farming area and that's what everybody's doing, then there are times when everybody's focused on getting the crop in and out. But in between that, you have a lot more leisure time, or you could take more leisure time to get to know your neighbors. So how you interact with people is going to be different.
When I a previous book of mine, I went on a book tour in Nebraska, put together by several small libraries, who like individually probably could not have had me out, but they combined. And so I was driven around to many of the kind of same communities that I ended up writing about years later in the Children's Wizard. And I just was struck by how far away everything was, and how, oh yeah, my doctor is 2 hours away. It was like nobody batted an eye about that was just kind of normal, that they would live out 2 hours away from the nearest town that had a doctor in it. And that was also another thing that kind of informed our decision about where we were going to move, was going to be, the closeness of amenities.
Mm.
And at the time I was living in Chicago, right, where, within, I don't know, half a mile, there'd be like 50 million doctors that I could just walk to. It was just very, very, it's just eye-opening to find how that people in that geographical area, and I'm sure you all experienced that in South Dakota too, that distance your measurement of distance, of what is a reasonable distance to travel for something, is a lot different than mine is.
That's right. Exactly. Pretty soon, you're going to be at the book festival, right?
Yes, I
Okay,
think this is going to be my first in-person event since the pandemic started. So I'm
oh,
very excited about that. Yeah.
well, we'll be, and as long as we're on that subject, Jennifer, can you remind us about the dates and what people need to do, the dress code and everything?
Dress code.
Well, we always say this year's festival's in Deadwood, and we always say anything goes in Deadwood. I get speakers
Oh,
asking me about the code sometimes, and I say, well, we have a lot of speakers that wear, business casual or business, but also those with the jeans and cowboy boots and the cowboy hats or the seed hats.
I
But
don't
we
have
are,
cowboy boots. Sorry.
yeah, well,
Maybe I'll get some.
I know of an author who actually bought some for her trip to South Dakota, and then of course some who already have theirs. But yeah, so we're in Deadwood the first weekend in October. It's October 1st through the 3rd. And Melanie will be appearing then in person. We'll actually get to meet, maybe shake hands. I don't know. We'll have to see how this all works. And even before that, she is doing a virtual tour of South Dakota. There are, I think that Yeah, there's some more information in the chat that
Mhm.
Ryan's put up, but her virtual tour will be the last week in July and the first week in August. There are 4 different dates when she's making, I think it's 9 different presentations, and it combines hosts of 12 different libraries or other organizations. So she will be speaking with groups a little bit like this, really focusing on the book and, you know, whether it's the process, the reader's reactions, all of that. So we're looking forward to that. She'll get to speak to a lot of different South Dakotans, and in any other year, we would have had her driving those long distances, but this year it'll all be on Zoom or some other platform. So you can find that on our website too. We're starting to announce all of those dates. So
I'm looking forward to that too.
And some of that information is in the chat, so you should grab it while you can, because we have actually come to the end of our wonderful time here. And I want to really thank Melanie again for a very lively conversation, a very interesting one. Glad you wrote the book, because that's stuff that we should really be thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Lawrence, right? I always want to call you Larry. That's probably not right, right? You look
You'd
like
be
a Lawrence.
surprised at the other things that people
Yeah. You look like a Lawrence to me.
Okay, well, everybody, thanks for joining us. We'll see you same time, same station next week, Thursday, and we'll look forward to it.
Thank you again. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.